This week on Q&A, our guest is Pierre Thomas of ABC News. He's the senior justice correspondent.
Pierre Thomas of ABC News, can you remember the first time you ever thought about the news business?
Actually, I do. I was, probably about 12 years old, and I was watching the evening news. And back where I grew up, Lynchburg, Virginia, it was the ABC affiliate that we watched in particular. And I used to watch the World News Tonight with Peter Jennings and Max Robinson. It was part of my daily ritual was to watch the news. And I said, that's interesting. I might want to do that one day.
So what would you have been, 7th grade then?
Yep, around that age. And it was funny. We would always typically watch the evening news. It came on at 6:30, and it was just after we would be finishing dinner.
What were the circumstances at home? What did your parents do, and how many kids were there in the family?
I'm one of 5, 2-parent household, mom and dad. My dad worked at a place called the Lynchburg Foundry, and a very hardworking man, worked sort of pouring steel. My mom was homemaker. And, typical, Southern Virginia family, lots of noise in the house. I was the youngest of my siblings. I think about that often, just great summers, lots of play. And my parents encouraged me to, really pursue education.
If we saw you in the middle of your high school experience, what would we have seen Pierre Thomas doing?
I had a reputation for sort of being a bookish kid. I did play basketball my senior year of high school. Wasn't very good. Rode the bench mostly. But I loved learning. Was a salutatorian of my high school, and before I went on to Virginia Tech.
Why'd you pick Virginia Tech?
It's interesting, Brian. I had an opportunity to go to some other schools. I think I had some interest from Yale, but it was primarily finances that Virginia Tech was offering some grants and some scholarship money, and it worked out that would be the perfect place to go, and have no regrets going there. Great institution.
At what time during your Virginia Tech experience did it become focused that you were going to do news, and where? What did you want to do initially?
Well, when I first got there, I was thinking about business and computer science, and it was interesting. I was doing pretty well in it, but sort of bored by it. It didn't feel like what I should be doing. And my sophomore year, I really did some soul searching. And one day I called my mother up and said, "Mom, I think I wanted to be a journalist." And she said, "Journalist? How much do they make?" It was pretty funny because I was first generation 4-year college student in my family. And the whole point of college to them was like, you go higher education, get a good job. And I remember telling my mother, well, if I'm good at it, I'll do okay. And she said, well, son, it's up to you. Just try to be good at it. And so I switched to communication and journalism my sophomore year.
We're going to come back to some of the details on the earlier life, but I want to jump into one of the videos from ABC. This is October 8th, 2009. It's about gang violence. Let's watch it, and then we'll come back and have you explain what you're doing.
Okay.
Chicago has an estimated 100,000 gang members, and law enforcement faces an enormous task. Our justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, was granted extraordinary access inside the battle.
It's 5 a.m. at a secret location in Chicago. Heavily armed U.S. Marshals and local police lock in on a target.
He is a gang member. He's a UVL, an unknown vice lord. Pretty much everything they do is through fear and violence.
Police, come to the door! The suspect's not home, but minutes later he unwittingly walks into the dragnet.
What's your name?
My name?
Yeah.
My name Antoine.
Got him.
Some suspects are defiant, like this member of the Black Pea Stone gang.
You're Black Pea Stone, aren't you?
Yeah, all the time.
It's been a busy morning. 5 suspects arrested in 4 hours, all wanted on drug charges, all suspected gang members.
Across town, the FBI is working with Chicago authorities to dismantle gang leadership. In this undercover surveillance video, a female gang member sells drugs in broad daylight. That is her 4-year-old daughter holding the drugs. She was a member of the New Breed gang that controlled this one-block area that included 8 buildings.
This gang was making approximately $80,000 per day in drug sales. 18-month period, there were 9 homicides and a like amount of aggravated battery shootings that were reported.
Only after authorities took out the gang leadership and arrested 56 gang members from the housing complex was there any real peace. But it's a battle for police to keep pace. That was clear when we went to Cook County Jail, the largest in the nation.
We've got approximately 9,000 male inmates here, and a good 90% of them, probably closer to 95%, are gang members.
This is gang, it's the Latin Saints.
But authorities are the first to admit they cannot arrest their way out of this problem.
It's not clear that we can really break up the gangs. It might be the case that the most we can hope to do is reduce the degree to which gangs engage in violence.
Do you remember why you joined?
Because I liked the lifestyle that they was living, money, the girls, the cars, you know, they had it all. I ain't see no wrong with selling drugs.
Have you been shot at?
Yes.
Have you shot at people?
Yes. It's either me or him. So really kill or be killed. I'll be thinking when my turn coming, because it's coming.
So you don't expect to live to be an old man?
No.
The cycle of violence will be hard to stop. Pierre Thomas, ABC News, Chicago.
Where did you get the idea to do that show?
You know, I had been talking to law enforcement officials, and they had been telling me about the gang problem getting worse. And they said it was one of those sort of untold stories that the country has yet to sort of come to grips with, that there's so many gang members, the fact that there are hundreds of, tens of thousands of gang members, and that they really dictate life in some communities. Working with John Banner, Charlie Gibson, and the tradition carried on by Diane Sawyer, I remember her emailing me after that particular piece saying that she thought it was powerful. You're given the license to go out and do these stories and spend some time to try to bring it home. And that story touched me in a way because that gang member, he was so direct, he was so honest. I said, have you been shot at? Yes. Have you shot at people? Matter of factly says yes. And I thought that brought home to people. Imagine living in a neighborhood where that guy is walking around. And it tells you that while the country is dealing with the economic issues that it's dealing with, there's a whole nother side that some communities are dealing with.
Tell us as much as you can about the mechanics of doing a piece like that. Where do you sit every day on a normal day, week basis at ABC?
I have an office. We were just a few blocks from the White House. And, what I try to do is talk to sources on the phone and visit people. And that particular story we got just by talking to law enforcement officials. And I had done a previous story with the U.S. Marshals on how they've been able to drive down crime in certain communities by focusing on what they call the worst of the worst, repeat offenders. And we decided that we wanted to do something on gangs because, again, I've been hearing more and more about that. So we called the Marshals and said, do you target gangs in Chicago? And they said, well, when you say worst of the worst, they are our first category of people that we're often dealing with. And they said, well, you can come out, be a fly on the wall, and just do what we do. We'll do what we do on a typical day. And that was a typical day, I think on a Wednesday, midweek in Chicago.
How much of your personality in relationship with the Marshal's office had to do with them saying, come on out, we trust you, Pierre?
Well, trust is that's a great word. That's a huge part of what I do. Because you have to first convince law enforcement to open themselves up to allow you to be a part of their world. And the only way you develop that trust is through your track record of stories. I mean, I'll tell people all the time, go look at clips, go look at stories I've written, get a sense of how I work. If you want to call my bosses, ask questions, I think that's part of, getting the trust of people to allow them to let you in, if you will.
And then when you get out there, what kind of restrictions do they put on you?
None, really. I mean,
you had a bulletproof vest on, didn't you?
Yes, and that was in part because they tell you, look, this, you're going to see what we normally do, And when we kick down that door, we don't know what is going to happen often. So you need to be prepared just in case, bullets start flying or there's a fight or whatever. And I've been able to see those kind of things happen from time to time. One particular shoot with the marshals, we were involved in a high-speed chase. The suspect ran, ended up, crashing his car. Every now and then they do have to fight suspects, and you're there, and you're trying to portray reality as it is.
How many people were with you from ABC?
That particular day, we had, I think, a two-person crew. My producer for that particular piece was a producer named Jack Date. He had a camera as well. He was shooting as well, so we had basically a three-man band.
And does everybody have a vest on?
Yes.
What kind of liability does the network have? I mean, how much fear is there that in case you happen to get hit, they got a problem on their hands?
I think that's sort of in the back of people's mind, but, to be honest with you, we have people in much more dangerous places like Afghanistan doing stories. So, while there is some risk, it's not huge risk because the law enforcement people, they're pretty clear about, keeping you sort of out of harm's way. You're there to record what's happening, but they do position themselves between you and what's happening.
How much total time did you spend on that story?
That was, in terms of setup, it was a 2-day setup. What we tried to do was 24 hours, sort of a life cycle, work cycle with that particular team. And that was all shot in one day, one night, and then produced and put on the air the next day.
And one thing that the fellow, he had his face blocked out, said that he was after cars, money, and girls. Is there any difference between what he wants and what some of the members of Congress have wanted here? We just saw this week. It's cars, money, and girls.
On some level, bad behavior is bad behavior, isn't it? Whether it's on Wall Street or whether it's on, on the street corner. It's basically people being selfish, wanting what they want.
What were your arrangements with the fellow that you talked to, the gang member that was blocked out? We couldn't see his face.
Well, when we went to the jail, again, that was sort of developed once we got to the jail. We didn't really know what kind of access we would get when we got to the jail. But when we got there, we saw, I think, he said, 98% of the inmates were gang members. And I asked the supervisor, I said, well, is there any way we could talk to somebody? And he said, okay, we'll ask. And I said, what are the conditions? And he said, well, we probably want to protect the guy's identity, face, voice, because talking to the media or anyone else can get you killed. So we were able to work that out with the inmate, make him feel comfortable that he could be honest, and I think he was.
Have you done other stories like this, and if so, where?
Let's see, I did for Nightline. We went to, we're doing a story about the gang MS-13, and that gang has its origins in Central America. So we actually went down, spent several days in Central America looking at the origins of the gang, and we did some interviews like that down there as well. And again, part of it is you want the subject to feel comfortable, and you're sort of acknowledging the conditions and the environment that people live in. And sometimes, again, for those people in their world, talking to the media or anyone else can be dangerous.
Let's back off of where you are now at ABC. How long have you been there?
I celebrated my 10th anniversary last November.
Before that, where were you?
CNN.
How long?
3 years. And then before that, I was at the Washington Post for 10 years.
And before that?
My first job was with the Roanoke Times and World News.
And when did you get interested in actually writing?
In college, I took this course, Professor Ura at Virginia Tech. And, for some reason, he took some interest in me, and he said, you might want to consider, journalism. And he helped me get the job once I graduated with the Roanoke Times and World News. I was there for 2.5 years and, covered a couple town halls, covered a city, covered a couple universities, covered crime, covered everything. And one day, one of my colleagues, his name is Greg Frill, I'm not sure where he is now, but he said, you might want to think about, going to a bigger paper and maybe the Post or New York Times. And I said, me? I'm a whippersnapper. And so one day I got the gumption to send Ben Bradlee some of my clips.
Who ran the post?
Who ran the post, and in less than a week, I got a letter, and part of me said, this is probably a Dear John letter saying thanks but no thanks, and but I opened it up, and he said, you got some pretty decent stuff there. Send me some more clips, and call this guy named Tom Wilkinson, who was one of his deputy managing editors, and of course I called Tom, and he said, Pierre Thomas, who's Pierre Thomas? We don't typically hire people from the Roanoke Times and World News. And I said, well, Mr. Bradley said to call you. And so he said, well, send me some more clips. And I eventually got some interviews, and then they hired me.
Did you ever ask Ben Bradley why he was attracted to your writing?
I did indeed.
What did he tell you?
I try to every now and then, have lunch with him and just catch up. And he said that it was clear that I had a hunger and that I was doing a lot of different kinds of story, and that basically I would work my ASS off.
Go back to that teacher that taught you about writing. What was one thing that he taught you that you still remember?
I think the greatest thing from him is that he exuded integrity, and I think, I try to do that, be that in my work, and he was just a gentleman, and he taught me that you can be aggressive and pursue stories, and it's interesting that theme I've seen throughout my career. When I got to the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, tough but thoughtful. Lynn Downey, who was then the managing editor, again in that same vein, and to be able at 24 to walk around the newsroom and see Bob Woodward and ask him questions, and David Broder and people like that, and ask them questions. Michael Wilbon, a terrific sports writer who was there at the time. Again, all these resources. And Bob Woodward, again, I noticed how dogged he was, but thoughtful. And, those two are not mutually exclusive.
This is from December the 31st, 2010, and if you listen closely to the numbers, they're hard to believe when it comes to the number of cell phones that are in jails.
In our GMA investigation this morning, Pierre Thomas heads to prisons to find out what happens when using a cell phone turns deadly.
These are cell phones taken from inmates in the South Carolina State Prison by Captain Robert Johnson and his contraband squad.
We would go in and search the inmates, search their living areas, search their work areas.
Captain Johnson's searches turned up cell phones hidden in every object imaginable. He's even seen phones shot over the fence with homemade bazookas and thrown over inside footballs. Captain Johnson did such a good job, it almost got him killed.
Inmate that had a cell phone called an ex-inmate and set up a hit on myself.
The hitman came to murder Johnson on a cold March morning.
He kicked the door in, yelled police. He shot me 6 times up in the chest. I guess the Lord just said, this guy's just too honorary to die. I'm gonna let him live.
Johnson's shooting is just the latest outrage in a string of crimes traced to inmates with cell phones.
Baltimore County 911. Our stepdad just got shot.
Carl Lackle was shot and killed outside of his home just a week before he was scheduled to testify against accused murderer Patrick Byers. Byers ordered the hit from jail on his cell phone. Convicted mass murderer Charles Manson was even caught with a cell phone in California. This year so far, more than 9,600 cell phones have been confiscated in California prisons.
The inmates have become so creative at sneaking cell phones into prison, officials across the country are turning to technology to deal with the flood of phones.
This managed access technology acts like a cell tower for the prison. If calls come from cell phones not on the prison's approved list, the calls will be blocked.
The cellular device you are using has been identified as contraband.
In Mississippi, just since August, the system has intercepted more than 600,000 calls and text messages from inmates. In those cases, blocking calls and potentially saving lives. For Good Morning America, Pierre Thomas, ABC News, Washington.
Where did you get this idea?
There was a Wire story that ran about the gentleman, the prison guard's sort of account.
Associated Press, where?
I think it was. And it just sort of struck me that there must be an interesting story behind what happened, just the human side of it. And then when you start digging around into the story, you see that this is not just a problem in that particular state, but it's a problem that prisons across the country are seeing, you say, okay, this is a story that we can expand out and, end up saying something about the prison system. Because when you see all those phones dumped out like that, you go, my goodness, how are they getting these phones, and the fact that they're using them to commit crimes within jail. Again, part of, I think, the beauty of our job is finding stuff that people find interesting. And that I think if you're sitting home, I want to do stories that people would talk about around the kitchen table. Like, did you see that? That's interesting.
So how does the process work? You get this idea, you read the wire service. Where do you go next before you can make your move to interview somebody?
Well, typically I'll have a conversation with my producer, and then we'll sort of say, okay, how can we find this person? Because, it's about storytelling. One of our new leaders at ABC, Ben Sherwood, who's a new president of the news division, he's really focused on storytelling. And that's the way, again, you draw people in. And so when we're trying to develop these stories, we're looking for a way to make them as real as possible. One of the differences between television and print, the writing's pretty much the same, with some tweaks and differences in terms of how you tell the story. But I think the biggest thing about television is, other than taste it and smell it, you can bring that story right to the people. And so we look for ways that we can tell stories that don't seem bureaucratic, that are sort of real to people, that people can identify with.
A little bit ago, I don't know how many months, the ABC announced they were going to drop 25% of their news staff.
Mm-hmm.
How has that been felt by you?
Well, you feel it in terms of colleagues that you grew to know and love when they're gone, and the experience that that left with them. But as in all industry, you carry on, and the people that remain are great, and they work hard, and you do the best you can do. I say that in terms of stories like that, you're only as good as the leadership that you have. And one thing I can say in terms of bragging about the place I work is that from David Weston, who left, to Ben Sherwood, and all the executive producers for the various shows, and our digital platform and our radio, all these people are interested in breaking news, doing stories that matter to people, where I think one of the greatest challenges for journalism right now is to remain relevant, to do stories that hit home where people actually live in terms of how they're going about trying to get through life.
This week, though, would be an example of a tremendous difference in the way two news organizations, not yours, approached the story of Anthony Weiner.
Mm-hmm.
NBC led with it the night he announced that he was wrong. CBS, first night of Scott Pelley as the anchor, didn't get to it for the first 10 minutes, purposely put it obviously purposely put it off for at least 3 stories.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd have been the boss, what would you have done?
This business is so subjective. I think it's clearly a story you have to do. This is a member of Congress behaving badly. When people hear about that, they want to know more. So I think you have to do the story. Then it's just a matter, I think, of looking at the mix of the day. And what I would tend to do, again, if I were in that position, is to look at the stories and say, okay, what affects the most people? What story affects the most people? And then what's the most interesting? And then try to find the right balance between the two.
I do want to ask you about ABC because Chris, I hope it's Cuomo, is that his first name, Chris? Did a piece had an exclusive piece on one of the women that was involved. And I want to run just a clip here to show you and ask you what are the rules at ABC on this kind of stuff?
26-year-old Megan Broussard of Texas says she first became acquainted with Weiner on April 20th. After seeing this video online and commenting on his Facebook page, it was hot.
Now, what does that mean?
I like to see someone who actually stood for something and was passionate about something.
Broussard says Weiner immediately responded to her Facebook comment. What she says soon followed was a flirtatious internet relationship, including, she claims, over 100 instant messages and eventually pictures.
He was eager to hear about if I wanted him or thought he was attractive or that sort of thing.
How much of it was sex talk?
I mean, he would attempt all the time.
Broussard says the two began exchanging a series of increasingly risque photos. Broussard sent these, which ABC has licensed from her.
In that piece, as you probably heard, there was a mention that ABC had paid money for a licensing fee for the photos. And this issue comes up all the time, paying for interviews. What are the rules now? Because if you didn't pay attention, you wouldn't even have known why Chris Cuomo was mentioning that.
Well, again, I don't know the particulars of what happened here. I know we don't pay for interviews. I think what that referred to was photographs, in terms of use of the photographs. And I guess some of the people that you interview say, in order for me to allow you to use these photographs, I expect a fee. But I know the interviews are not paid for.
But isn't that just I'll use the word, kind of a phony front that you're really paying for that interview?
You know, boy, that's an interesting question. I don't think so, in the sense that, you know, what you're saying with the interview is that, you know, we want to interview you and we're going to ask you whatever we think we should ask you. And if that is not controlled by anything other than ABC News pressing and asking the questions that we want to ask you, I think you can do the interview. And again, you want the elements to be able to show what you're talking about. So occasionally you may have to pay the money to get those elements to see, well, what exactly are we talking about? What did he send to her? What did he show to her? And again, I suppose you could do the interview without the pictures, but you also have to think about the viewer at home. They're going to want to see those pictures.
But she may not have allowed the interview if you hadn't paid for the licensing of them.
Again, I don't know what the specifics are, but I can tell you that, you know, if she had not provided the pictures, I think they still would have done that interview.
Maybe she wouldn't have, though. Maybe she'd have shopped it around to NBC or CBS.
Well, I think at that point, that's when the leadership would say, okay, shop it. You know, but we have to be able to interview you, and without any restrictions. And again, we want the elements. You know, we want the elements. And I think that you'll see pretty much all the news divisions say that, okay, in order to get these elements, how else can we get them? Short of, we can't subpoena them, obviously. Sometimes I guess you would have to pay the money to get the pictures.
So again, as a reporter, and you have, how many people work on your team at all times?
Let's see, we have 2 producers and 1 on-fair.
And they're all working for you all the time?
We work together all the time, yes.
So who gives you permission to move ahead and spend money on one of these pieces?
We have leadership, the various shows, and again, the news division, leadership management will, we will pitch what we call a pitch. We'll develop the story. We'll say, this is what we can do. Can we go do it? And pretty much after they bless it, we go out and do it.
Do you pitch each show, like Good Morning America or Nightline or the evening news shows, independent of one another?
Yeah, we do that. Sometimes I pitch them simultaneously. Sometimes it will be, if it's breaking news, it's something that I will put out to the entire news division and say, this is something we should focus on, and then we go from there.
But, say your cell phone story, how many places ran that?
I think that was exclusive to GMA.
And then
.com, we had a .com version, and I think I did some radio on it. So
I know we're in the weeds on this, but does GMA then have to pay for it under their budget? Is that the way that works?
Pretty much, yeah.
Let's go to July of 2009, and this is a piece you did on on lax security in federal buildings.
In this exclusive video, watch closely as a congressional investigator walks live bomb components right by security in a federal building, compromised in 27 seconds.
It's stunning, it's shocking. It just says that basically some people have forgotten the lessons of 9/11.
In fact, investigators went to 10 federal buildings at undisclosed locations across the country and got the same result.
And here's a result of what could have happened. Potentially deadly explosions.
This Federal Protective Service, to me, has got trouble from top to bottom.
Investigators found this guard sleeping at his post, learned that a guard accidentally fired his weapon while practicing pulling it out in the bathroom, discovered that one guard was so distracted he actually ran a baby in a carrier through an x-ray machine.
The central issue that I see in this whole really major problem is lack of training.
Homeland Security officials say they take the results of the investigation very seriously and have taken short-term and long-term steps to address them. With 9,000 federal buildings to protect, they have to. For Good Morning America, Pierre Thomas, ABC News, Washington.
Where'd you get that?
Working with members of Congress, we try to pursue stories that are, again, in Homeland Security, that cover law enforcement, justice, Homeland Security issues. And we say, look, whenever there's something that might be interesting, give us a heads up, and that this report was coming out, and we were able to get an advance copy of it and do the story.
How often are you contacted by the person that wants you to cover something, and how often do you initiate it yourself?
I think it's 50-50. I mean, I think I'm constantly making calls. Calls are coming in. Again, it's I sort of take the vacuum cleaner approach in terms of trying to find out as much things as I can, and then sort of prioritizing what the most interesting stories are.
What are your daily habits of getting information? Where do you go?
I usually start before I leave my house. I start making calls to various law enforcement agencies, talking to people, what's coming up today. That continues when I get to the office. And again, I think in this business, to be successful, you have to be at what I call tiptoe status, where you're always sort of leaning forward, looking for stories.
You say you use the term law enforcement officers all the time. What does that include?
I cover FBI, I cover DHS, DEA.
DHS is Department of Homeland Security?
Department of Homeland Security. I cover immigration and customs, all those different agencies. And again, it's a lot to have on your plate, but I think that's what makes the job interesting.
How far is the government willing to go with you about the security problem in these buildings?
Well, it's interesting. Some of the agencies aren't that thrilled when you do stories that are not flattering to them. But generally speaking, if you tell them, look, this is what the story is about, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to say what you need to say about this issue, they're okay with it. But I think there is sort of a muckraking aspect to what we do in terms of exposing wrongdoing, and I think that's important because, again, the American public still needs, I think, good journalism. I think we provide a useful service to the public.
We're going to show a clip in a moment, the Ted Stevens trial. We covered a lot of that here, not on a day-to-day basis, but kind of the overall discussion of what went on there. The public integrity section of the Justice Department was involved in the indictment and all that, and then they threw the whole case out, but they just, they're involved again with John Ensign. Explain where that sits in the Justice Department, that section.
It's under the criminal division of the Justice Department. Their job is to look at public officials by and large and root out wrongdoing. The Stevens case was clearly a case that was less than their finest moment, and it's an example of even though they got the conviction, they did some things that were questionable. And at the end of the day, while Mr. Stevens may have done some things that he should not have been doing, the department has to be held to a higher standard in terms of the people to prosecute.
The judge at the time ordered a study done on what happened. Did they ever publish that study?
I have to go back and look. I think that review is maybe still underway.
April the 1st, 2009. This is your report on Ted Stevens.
Last fall, the 40-year political career of Senator Ted Stevens ended in disgrace. But today, Attorney General Eric Holder pulled the plug on the case, saying evidence was withheld and that it was in the interest of justice to dismiss the indictment and not proceed with a new trial.
The jury verdict here was obtained unlawfully. The government violated the Constitution of the United States.
A jury convicted Stevens of lying about thousands of dollars in gifts and renovations to his Alaska home, which was transformed from a modest cabin to what he called the chalet. But after the trial, the court learned that prosecutors may have intentionally allowed a key witness to mislead the jury. And an FBI agent who had worked the Stevens case leveled even more allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. FBI agent Chad Joy claimed in a whistleblower lawsuit that prosecutors had tried to keep a key witness from testifying, and that one of the lead agents in the case accepted gifts from witnesses and sometimes had them over for dinner.
The misconduct of the prosecutors was stunning to me. They were hell-bent on convicting a United States senator.
Federal prosecutors face an internal investigation and the possibility of prosecution themselves.
The prosecution was tainted, and that taint could never be satisfactorily removed.
No!
Stevens was legendary for his temper and his ability to get billions in federal dollars for his state. Throughout the ordeal, he was defiant.
I look only forward, and I still see the day when I can remove the cloud that currently surrounds me.
That day now appears a lot closer. Pierre Thomas, ABC News, Washington.
How important is it that you, for instance, do your stand-up outside of the Justice Department? It seems like that's a lot of expense to go there just to have the U.S. Justice Department over your shoulder.
Well, in this particular case, because they were, in the crosshairs, if you will, I wanted the public to see, hey, this is a part of the story. And, that building carries a lot of symbolism with it. So that's part of the reason why you do it. But that story, I know that was a sad, difficult day for the Justice Department, the people inside that building.
Why?
Because, again, their job is to root out injustice and to see members of their own staff possibly be engaged in inappropriate behavior. That's a tough, bitter pill for them to swallow.
Now, you've interviewed Eric Holder. We're going to show some clips of that in just a moment. Why did the Attorney General, a Democrat in the new administration, let Ted Stevens off? I mean, he didn't have to do anything.
Well, it's interesting. In a previous interview with the AG, Holder, he said, I'm not the Secretary of Justice. I'm the Attorney General, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the country. And, the Attorney Generals who try to do that job well, sort of look at it in that vein that, it's regardless of Republican, Democrat, if there's something that goes wrong or goes awry, it's their job to deal with it. And, he looked at that case, and he had worked in the public integrity section back when he was a younger attorney at the Justice Department, and he knew the standard that was supposed to be met in that particular place. And he felt in this case that there were some questions, serious questions about how they performed their duties.
How long have you known him?
Boy, I knew him when he was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. So I've known him probably over 15 years now.
And who were you working for in the beginning?
Washington Post when I first met him.
Does that matter now that and how you get access to him?
No, I would like to think that he feels like he has a sense of me in terms of, how I go about doing my business and whether I'm fair or not. So I do think that, it plays a role, and you try to use it to your advantage, obviously.
How long did it take you to get this exclusive interview we're going to show portions of?
A series of weeks, if not months. Getting him to talk in a situation like that, it doesn't happen very often. And because these people who are in these high-level jobs that don't do a lot of press conferences and that don't do a lot of sit-down interviews, they realize that what they say, when they say it, has significant impact. So it took some doing to get the interview.
Any ground rules?
No. Just I could get to ask him what I'm going to ask him.
Here's December the 21st, an excerpt, 2010.
What keeps you up at night?
The concern that perhaps that we might have missed something. The threat is real. The threat is different. The threat is constant.
In a rare interview, the Attorney General laid out the most pressing terror threats. Dangers, he said, that are more diverse and increasing. Among them, the new rapidly evolving threat posed by homegrown radicals.
The threat has changed from simply worrying about foreigners coming here to worrying about people in the United States, American citizens, raised here, born here. You didn't worry about this even 2 years ago.
In the last 18 months, at least 50 Americans have been charged with planning acts of terrorism. And Holder, in a sober assessment, said an American member of Al-Qaeda, radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, may now be as grave a threat as Osama bin Laden himself. Awlaki, Holder says, is a clear and present danger.
He's an extremely dangerous man. He has shown a desire to harm the United States, a desire to strike the homeland of the United States.
The U.S. suspects Awlaki, who is believed to be hiding in Yemen, helped mastermind the Christmas underwear bomb plot and a recent scheme to blow up cargo planes.
He is a person who, an American citizen, familiar with this country, and he brings a dimension because of that American familiarity that others do not.
And where would you rank him, or can you rank him?
He would be on the same list with bin Laden. He's up there. I don't know whether he's 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know, but he's certainly on the list of the people who worry me the most.
Does the U.S. have a preference in terms of Al-Awlaki? Dead, captured, or prosecuted?
Well, we certainly want to neutralize him, and we will do whatever we can in order to do that.
Get nervous anymore?
Me? Yeah, all the time. I care about what I do, and I want to do well. And I think whenever you feel like that, there's a certain amount of nervous feelings that come into doing the job.
How do you walk the fine line of not being too aggressive, but not being too soft so that they'll invite you back?
I think that's just through the many conversations that you're having with them and their staff, where you tell them, look, this is the job. The job is to ask you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I have what I call the no surprise rule. And if you sort of tell people where you're coming from and what you have to do, and that's what their expectation is, you usually don't have any problems. I mean, I think some of the role of the media is to be adversarial, but at the end of the day, I'm trying to provide a service to people, and it's my job to get them the answers that they should have.
What is Eric Holder like when the cameras are off?
Very similar to that. That interview, he was very sober, in part because I think he was trying to convey to the American public that the threat of terrorism is quite real, an ever-present danger, if you will. But he's very sort of low-key, easygoing, with a wry sense of humor as well.
Why do you think he has worked his way up successfully from being a U.S. attorney to being a deputy over at the Justice Department to being the Attorney General?
I've gotten to know him over time, and he clearly was making a lot of money in a law firm when he was asked to be Attorney General. So I think there's a certain amount of patriotism that is associated with people in Washington that doesn't often get talked about, where people are asked to serve and they come back and serve at some cost to them and their family. I would sort of put him in that category, with many other people in Washington.
Here's some more of your interview.
Al-Awlaki also allegedly encouraged the Fort Hood gunman and at least 12 suspected homegrown radicals charged with attempted acts of terror. His teachings and writings have been discovered on their computers.
One of the things that struck me is that how many of these people have been radicalized online.
The ability to go into your basement, turn on your computer, find a site that has this kind of hatred spewed. They have an ability to take somebody who is perhaps just interested, perhaps just on the edge, and take them over to the other side.
To cope, the U.S. is monitoring scores of radicals and has set up stings to combat the homegrown threat. But the increasing number of stings is not without controversy.
The critics say that the stings that the FBI has been doing basically amount to entrapment.
We're going to do whatever it is that we have to do in order to protect the American people. Options are always given all along the way for them to say, you know what, I've changed my mind. I don't want to do this. And up to now, everyone has said, everyone that we've charged has said, no, I want to go forward. And all of those actions were designed to kill Americans.
Holder said the U.S. has made great strides in improving its ability to detect and block attacks. The intelligence community is literally working around the clock, and Al-Qaeda Central has been degraded.
Have we been lucky or good?
I'd like to think that we're good.
But he said while confident the U.S. will continue to thwart attacks, the pressure is unrelenting, and there are no guarantees.
The American people have to be prepared for, potentially bad news.
Holder says much of the intelligence is chilling. In sharing a bit of personal insight, he said one of the few things that gives him a sense of normalcy is helping his children with homework.
Speaking of children, do you have any?
I have a little boy, 8-year-old Nathaniel Charles Thomas, named after his two granddads.
Does he watch on television?
He does indeed. He's a terrific little kid. He's in the autism spectrum, but he's really bright and he's making excellent progress in school. Just a great. He is the joy of my wife Allison in our lives. He's a great kid.
Where'd you meet your wife?
My wife I met at my college roommate's wedding, and she sort of ignored me at that wedding. And we later met after my college roommate said, you should call Allison up and see if she'll go out with you. And I convinced her to go out with me, and the rest is history. It took some doing, but I'm a better man for it.
How long have you been married?
Been married since 1998.
Go back to the interview. How much of that report that we saw in Good Morning America did you write?
All of it.
And when you're, with all the clips that you picked up and all the artwork that's done, who does that?
We have producers and editors that do the visual side. And, you know, I consult with my producer, obviously, on the writing, but I typically like to write my pieces myself.
So a piece like this was shown on how many different outlets that you have at ABC?
That was, again, an exclusive for Good Morning America. We ran it on radio, excerpts of it. We ran it on our .com platform. And I think throughout, I think clips of it probably ran with the affiliates, too.
So over the years, you've been there 10 years. How has television news changed for the reporter?
You know, at ABC, I would say my job is primarily the same. I think the one difference is that, you know, we have to make sure we serve all the different platforms. So when I do a piece for one of the broadcasts, I'm also going to do radio. I'm also going to write typically a .com piece.
And that's, you're talking about?
Simultaneously. So when that piece...
The digital, you're talking about the web.
Yeah, abcnews.com. And so, and we have a digital channel as well called ABC News Now that we contribute to as well. So, you know, basically it's in this age of Facebook and Twitter, you're trying to get as much of your information. I also Facebook and I have a Twitter account as well. So you're trying to connect with people as many different ways as you can.
So what kind of tweets do you do on a normal day?
Well, it's typically centered around whatever piece I'm working on. I'll say, hey, check out this coming up on World News or Good Morning America or Nightline, which is another show I like to do. And it's typically always work related about the story, you know, reminding people of something I've done or I'm about to do.
What's the difference and the feedback that you get from being a Washington Post reporter for 10 years and being an ABC television news reporter for 10 years?
It's funny, when I was at the Washington Post, I occasionally would, you know, be in McDonald's or wherever, and I'd see somebody reading the paper, and it looked like they would be reading my story, and I go, oh, that's sort of cool, they're reading my story. Now, because, you know, you're seen by a lot of people come up to you, and they really do talk to you as if they know you, because I guess you're coming into their home, and that took some getting used to. You know, I'll be in the supermarket in a t-shirt and shorts running an errand for my wife, and someone will come up and say, "Hey, that was an interesting story you did," and, you know, and you say, "Oh yeah, I am on TV." So, you know, that's taken some getting used to, just being part of the story that you're conveying.
Into January this year, 2011, Jared Loughner, this is Arizona, and Gabby Giffords.
How Jared Lee Loughner spent the hours before the shooting browsing the internet, as so many people do, but with a very specific purpose. And we begin on all of this with Pierre Thomas, who is here tonight. Pierre.
Diane, sources tell us that Loughner's planning for that deadly rampage appears to have been much more meticulous than we previously knew.
Loughner was apparently contemplating every aspect of his assault, including the likely punishment. According to an official familiar with the investigation, Loughner used his home computer to browse a website with information about the effects of lethal injection. The source says he appeared to want to know what death by injection felt like. Lethal injection is the method of capital punishment imposed by the federal government. Loughner also allegedly browsed the internet for information about solitary confinement. And perhaps more disturbing, an official said, he had been researching political assassins. Sources say it all paints a dark picture of cold-blooded forethought and an obsession with assassinating Congresswoman Giffords. Some legal scholars believe the new evidence makes an insanity defense, a long shot for success, even more difficult.
The extent to which he planned the shootings makes it seem inconsistent with someone who doesn't know what he's doing or doesn't know right from wrong.
Legal scholars say that Loughner has left his defense attorneys limited options. And Diane, I can tell you, the man I saw in court myself, openly grinning and smiling, appeared to have no remorse.
You were telling me when he walked in the door, he seemed to be in a different place because of the way he was smiling.
All the reporters seemed to sort of gasp when he walked in because he was just smiling, very happy.
Pierre Thomas reporting.
These are in the weeds questions again, but where was that set?
At our bureau in Washington.
Because you had snow behind Diane Sawyer, and you did not have anything behind you except it looked like the Lincoln Memorial.
Right, yeah. It was snowing that day. In fact, we all, went out for dinner after the show in the snow. I remember that night pretty well. It was a cold winter day, and we got this information that was breaking on Loeffner. And I have to tell you, of stories that you cover, that's one of the more sad stories, because you have people who showed up in sort of a celebration of democracy in Tucson to meet with their congressman, and they were gunned down for no reason.
Did you go to Arizona?
I did. The week of the shooting, it happened on a Saturday. I flew out on the Sunday night and got there just in time to do my Good Morning America live shot and story.
What's the first thing you notice when you are coming from outside on a story when you get there? What is always different than what you think it's going to be?
I'm always struck about how nice people are in a lot of these locations that have had tragedy. The humanity that people show you, even though it's a difficult circumstance that they're going through. The people of Tucson could not have been nicer, and so you're immediately struck by that what this horrible thing that happened is not necessarily a reflection of the entire community.
There are other things in your report I want to ask about. You talk about officials familiar with the investigation. No names. Then later you said allegedly he browsed the web.
Right.
And then after that you said legal scholars say this.
Right.
We don't know who you've been talking to. Why
exactly. not? In this kind of story, a lot of what we do is getting people to tell us things that they probably shouldn't be talking about. So you have to give a certain amount of anonymity to them. In general terms, when people see my stories, they know I'm talking to either law enforcement sources or people associated with the defense side. So we do try to give some protection for candor, because what I'm trying to get is reality as best I can determine it. I use allegedly because until he's convicted of doing certain things, and again, I didn't see him do these things, I still, even though I'm talking to people I trust in terms of putting out the information, I still have to give some qualifiers.
We show you now in a roundtable discussion on This Week with Martha Raddatz and Jake Tapper, and I'll ask you about this experience compared to the other things you do.
Okay. The Times Square bombing originated Pakistan. The attack that they were planning on the United States, 2009, September 14th, around the anniversary of 9/11, also originated in Pakistan.
So tell me, Pierre, about you were talking about the lone wolf, but also about what seems to have come out, that Osama bin Laden was very interested in not just financial and other warfare against the United States, but class warfare, racial tension, stirring that up as well.
I spoke to officials Friday who were just stunned at the level of expertise and thoughtfulness that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda put into how to break down the American society, not just to kill people. They talked about ways in which to recruit minorities to do some of these attacks. The notion to get Americans thinking about each other, looking at each other in strange ways. So that was part of the plan as well.
How much do you worry about giving your opinion in a situation like that?
Well, for me it's sort of easy, because when they bring us into that role, they're looking for sort of beyond what I've been reporting during the week, and sort of pulling back the notebook a little bit, go into the notebook a little bit deeper, give it a little bit more insight into what you've been covering and what you've been gleaning from people, and giving more perspective to it. So in some ways that's a lot more fun, because I get to expand a little bit more about the nature and the tone that people are giving me when I have conversations.
Now, you're covering the Justice Department and the Homeland Security. Which of all these departments that you cover is the best source on bin Laden?
You're asking me to give away trade secrets here.
No, I'm not asking you to give away the name of people, but I mean, where do you find the best information, and not just those two places in town?
To be honest with you, Brian, I try to talk to as many different sources at different places to accumulate a sense of what the truth is. So in a story like this, I was using all the above, to be honest with you. I was checking and double checking with multiple different places in terms of up the food chain, down the food chain, in terms of the rank of people, because that story was so important that you wanted to make sure you nailed it, and whatever you were saying to the American public about it was right.
In your opinion, what's the biggest mistake you've ever made?
thankfully, I've been able to avoid huge mistakes.
Ever been sued?
No.
Who did you make the maddest?
I think I've made people angry when you do stories that are very critical of the job that they do. I remember doing stories at the Washington Post about security firms that were losing their guns, literally, unaccounted for weapons that were turning up in crimes. I remember doing a story about ATF in the era when Washington was sort of, awash in gun violence. The story, I was part of a team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And those stories sort of dealt with how could there be all this gun violence in the city that had banned handguns. And after that series ran, I came back to it again and did a story about ATF and as an agency. Were they contributing somehow?
What's ATF, by the way?
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And the story looked at whether they were contributing to the problem. And I remember one particular story was about how, due to lax oversight, a guy in Baltimore, a drug dealer in Baltimore, actually got a license to sell guns. And he sold guns out of the trunk of his car. And those guns turned up in crime after crime after crime and after crime. And when you peel back the onion, what you found is that you could get a gun dealer's license, a 3-year license, for $30. And often no one would come to your place of business to check to see if you had a structure, to get your background information, to see if you've been to jail, nothing. And the agency wasn't that happy about that story.
You've been in the middle of Washington for
excuse me,
25 years.
Mm-hmm.
People are very frustrated with this town. The respect level is way low. How should Americans feel about their democracy?
Great question. I think that part of our job, I'll answer it this way. I think part of our job is to show, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so the public can see how these people conduct themselves, see what issues they're focused on, see how they go about doing and dealing with these issues. And I think that part of the frustration that people have is sometimes that there's so much bickering going on in Washington that there's not a lot getting done. I don't think that any reasonable person can sit here and say that the country does not face huge issues. And I think people who are, again, sitting around at that kitchen table that we talked about earlier are wondering, well, who's looking out for me? Who's dealing with helping me keep and maintain a job and support my family and educate my children? Who is doing that? And I think some of the frustration that people have is there's so much white noise coming out of this town that they don't sometimes think that people are really, that people here are looking out for them.
Last question, we've got almost no time. Who do you favor, in your mother or your father, in the way you look much like one or the other, act like one or the other?
I think I look a little bit like both of them. My father died about 6 years ago. Miss him. My mother, I think I get she's a people person. She loves being around people. From my father, who in that job where he said on cold winter days, quote, sweat's running out of my shoes, he didn't miss a day for 10 years. In working that job, I think I get my work ethic.
Pierre Thomas, ABC News, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.